Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations questioning Goldman Sachs executives. It continues at this hour. We're about to hear from Lloyd Blankfein, but I'm joined here on the Hill by Senator Ted Kaufman, the Democrat from Delaware, who's a member of this panel, has had a chance to question some of these Goldman executives today, just fresh from the floor, where there's been another vote on regulatory reform. First, the news on that, unsuccessful. Democrats not successful again in bringing this to the floor.
Absolutely.
Your reaction to that?
Well, I just don't know what my Republican colleagues are thinking about. I genuinely don't know. I mean, everybody, I think, wants to do something about Wall Street reform. We've got things we have to do. It's one thing wherever I go, there's jobs, and then right below jobs is Wall Street reform. And why they wouldn't allow this even to come up to begin discussion, I really don't understand. I've been hanging around this place for a long time. I've taught about it. I just have no idea what their thinking is. Let's get it on the floor, and let's start talking. Let them start offering amendments.
All right, I'm going to ask you a couple of specifics about that in just a second, but let me get your take on what you've heard today in this hearing from the Goldman Sachs executives. What do you take away from their testimony so far? It's been confrontational. They've been defensive. They've defended their own actions. What do you make of it?
Well, I think that, this is the fourth day of hearings we had, and Chairman Levin's done a great job. The first thing we started out with is we had Washington Mutual, big bank that failed, found out kind of what was going on out there in the marketplace, especially in Washington and California. And then we had the regulators who regulated them. And there's a big letdown in regulation. This idea of self-regulation was never a good idea, and clearly that went on. And then we had the rating agencies. They're part of the puzzle. But really, when you look at it, what happened is the investment banking on Wall Street really created this gigantic market that just sucked up all these kinds of things and made it very, very attractive for mortgage brokers and everybody else to go out and loan people money for houses. Now, people responsible that took the money, but they loaned people money. We had this incredible situation where at one time Washington Mutual, 90% of their home equity loans were what they call stated income loans. And a stated income loan is you come into a bank and they say, hey, Ted, how much do you make? And I give them a number. And they say, good. Okay, next question. And they don't even go back to check it. 90% of the loans, and the vast majority of these instruments that were based on these residential mortgage-backed security things, they went under. But how could you expect them not to go under when you did it? But there was this great, there was people down at the lower levels who did bad things, who created fraud and things like that. But really, you can see that by the attitudes here in Wall Street, they just created this gigantic market into which all the rest of this fell.
Well, let me ask you about that, because the argument made by these Goldman executives, and they have consistently, listen, we may have packaged up, securitized these mortgages, subprime mortgages, but we were selling them to sophisticated investors. And just because we saw this thing turning sour, they didn't. That doesn't necessarily mean we did a bad thing.
Oh, no, but they were responsible for doing diligence. I mean, they were saying that the state income loans are a bad thing. We had one of the regulators from the Treasury who said during one of our hearings that this kind of stated income loan thing was just an example of what went on, and he said they were target-rich environment for fraud. And what these guys did when they did it, they didn't go back and check and see that 90% of these others were state auction. You cannot say, I've got a car, I sell it to somebody, I don't tell them the fact that the engine's no good, I can't go back to them later and say, hey, look, it was, you're savvy, you know automobiles, that's not my problem.
So being a sophisticated investor, those folks, to some extent, you think they were taken advantage of here?
Oh, I think, clearly. I mean, look at this, on this Abacus deal, which is the one they're talking about. Clearly, I mean, sophisticated investors with their banks overseas have lost $700 billion. So, I mean, $700 million. So, clearly, sophisticated investors is one thing, but the secret to all this thing is transparency. There was not transparency in these things in terms of some of the key decisions about the quality of these loans. Clearly, there was no regulation. Clearly, they had people out there who were greedy at all levels of this thing. People went out and said, I made $500,000 a year when they only made $100,000. They're culpable just because they did it. But when you see these very sophisticated folks on Wall Street who were incredibly sophisticated, then taking this and packaging it up and continuing to sell it 2006, 2007, and then go short, basically sell these short. They said, well, look, I had to offset my long position. What the rest of us do, if I have a position in a stock or a bond, it's not working out, I sell it. That's how I reduce my risk. They didn't do that. They went out and made these short sales and made billions of dollars.
Let me just share with our viewers, you're seeing it on the screen there, Lloyd Blankfein is in the hearing room there getting ready for his testimony. It does continue with the second panel. Right now we will, of course, bring you Lloyd Blankfein's testimony when he does appear in front of the panel. Let me continue just a couple more quick questions for you, because I know you'd probably like to get back in there, ask Lloyd Blankfein some questions. There are questions on Wall Street right now. People scratching their head. They're saying, listen, Ted Kaufman, these senators, they're They're vilifying Goldman Sachs for doing exactly what this investment bank was supposed to do. They saw problems coming. They made money. That's what these guys are supposed to do for their shareholders. And they're wondering, what's this all about?
They did a lot more than that. I think I say, I mean, they were basically selling instruments that really were underwater before they sold them. I'm not, look, investment bankers and the rest of it, everybody has a right to make their business. And part of the problem has to go to the regulators because they just let them go. I mean, basically, we had a theory here in Washington during the last 8 years that essentially said, it's like football. We don't need referees. You know, they stop the game, they blow the whistle, they do all these things. Let's get the referees off the field and just play. So that was part of it. And in that environment, Goldman Sachs and many others, Washington Mutual, the rating agencies, all of them kind of just said, well, you know, this is what's in my interest. The one thing you got to be concerned about with regard to Goldman Sachs is how often they were faced with tough decisions. I've got a client, I sold the client something, or I'm about to sell something to the client something. I don't think that's good anymore. So I'm going to go off and sell it short over here in order to make money to offset it. That's what it is. Look, I want investment banking to prosper. I want these businesses to prosper, but not at the risk that they're going to do the same thing they did over again. And I think that that's really what we have to look at. Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers went down. We bailed out AIG. I mean, it was a disaster for this country. So we got to take a hard look at it, and that's what regulatory reform is all about.
All right, let me ask you one final question about that, because you've even questioned whether or not the bill that's coming to the floor, Democrats are trying to bring to the floor, is tough enough, particularly when it comes to the size of large banks. You want to try, your proposal would essentially force the breakup of banks right now?
Well, look, in 1929 we had a massive failure in this country, a massive depression. It brought the depression. And what we did in 1933, we passed a bill called Glass-Steagall. And what Glass-Steagall says, look, guys, commercial banks are made so that you can take your money, make them FDIC insured, so you can take your money out of the mattress or out of the tin can in the backyard, you can invest in there and know it's safe. Investment banking, this should be a very low-risk business. Investment banking is a very risky business. We should not have investment banking and commercial banking under the same roof. That worked in this country for 60 years. Then in 1999, we passed a bill, and we said, okay, you can get in business together. And I think that was the beginning of the problem. So the first step I want to do to introduce the size of these banks is separate out the investment bankers from the commercial bank. That's the first thing. The second thing is, just 15 years ago, the 6 largest commercial banks in this country made up 17% of our gross domestic product. You know what they make today? 62%. These are Bahamas. The idea that you could take these are $2 trillion in assets. Some of these have $2 trillion in assets. You could take a business with $2 trillion in assets that has relationships around the world, that has borrowed loads of money short term and lend it out long term, which is the basic thing for run, and that you could resolve these somehow. It's just hard for me to believe. There is no resolution across these countries' lines. So what I want to do is I want to end forever too big to fail, and I think there's already some banks that are some institutions that are already too big to fail. But this is a good bill. We should bring it to the floor. I'm going to offer my proposals to Maria Cantwell and John McCain. I've joined with them on a bill to bring back Glass-Steagall. Sheridan Brown and I have a good proposal to kind of cap how much money you have to have, make sure you have money for capital, but don't have too many liabilities. So there's a number of different approaches to take. This is a good bill. We just want to make it better. One
final question on Goldman. Based on what you heard today, do you think Goldman Sachs crossed more than an ethical line? Did they cross any legal lines?
That's a hard question. That is really a hard question. But what we did was we put a lot of money in. The first thing I did when I came here, we put $175 million into the Justice Department, Securities Exchange, to go out and solve that problem. Take a look at these things. Take a hard look. That is an incredibly complex problem to figure out. But I think it's well worth looking into. And do I think there was fraud in this process? I think there was a lot of fraud in this process. And there were a lot of conflict of interest. People went over the line. There was nobody watching. People made a lot of money at a time when America was suffering. I absolutely believe there's fraud in there somewhere, and I'm not going to be happy until we look through it and see. If at the end it turns out that there was no fraudulent behavior, then that's the way it goes. But I want us to take a good hard look at it. Justice Department, Criminal Division's looking at it, Securities Exchange Commission is looking at it, and I'm really looking forward to see what they come up with.
All right, Senator Kaufman, thank you for the time. Appreciate you joining us here on Bloomberg. Know you're going to likely head back to that hearing, be able to question Lloyd Blankfein. You see the picture of Lloyd Blankfein on your screen right now. He's gearing up, ready to testify. I need to let you know as well that after he wraps up his testimony, he's also going to be talking to our Betty Lou, a one-on-one